All right, so today we're going to be talking about astrology and yoga. What do they have in common, and how can we bring these two topics together as we're, you're all studying to become yoga teachers, and so it's important to have some understanding of one of the great foundational spiritual sciences of yoga, which is astrology. I'm not a Vedic or Jyotish Indian astrologer, but I do study Hellenistic astrology, which has its roots in the same shared language and theory as Indian astrology. So the ancient classical Greco-Roman astrology is very, very similar to the way that astrology is still being practiced in India today. So the way that I practice is very similar to the way that you might see your chart presented or get a reading from an Indian astrologer. In fact, I was in Calcutta in February for an astrology conference, and at that conference I had a chance to meet and talk with a lot of Indian astrologers, and I felt it was kind of neat to see that there were probably, I don't know this for sure, but there were probably a lot more things that that were familiar to me in Indian astrology than a lot of my colleagues who maybe didn't know about, say, anything about ancient Hellenistic Greco-Roman astrology. So that was really cool for me. And I was actually able to take some techniques that I learned and apply them very easily because they were so incredibly similar to ancient Greek astrology. So at any rate, I have to make that qualification because what I'm going to say today about yoga and astrology is not rooted in my expertise in Indian astrology per se, but it is the shared tradition of astrology between East and West is very similar in many respects, and especially in the core of ancient Greek sort of Hellenistic philosophy and how similar it is to the philosophy passed down through the Vedic tradition in India. So they're so similar in so many ways. But the reason that you want to know something about all of this in general is like the same reason that in a yoga teacher training program you would get something about Ayurveda, because it's one of the great sciences, it's sort of sister science of the yogic tradition, right? So you want to know about herbs, you want to know about medicine, you want to know about how to take care of the body. And another thing that accompanied Ayurveda very commonly in that part of the world and with this spiritual science of yoga is astrology. Now, what I want to talk about first is what are the features and characteristics of ancient astrological philosophy and how do they share similarities with the basic, say, philosophy that you see in something like the Yoga Sutras. You guys have read some of the Yoga Sutras already, right? A little bit. Okay, good. So, so let's talk about, does anyone remember in the Sanskrit the first line of the Yoga Sutras? Very sort of famous first line. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Does anyone remember that? Does that sound familiar at least? Okay, yeah. I mean, it's hard to remember the Sanskrit, but Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, it means yoga is the cessation of the turnings of the mind. Yoga is the stopping of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. So we know that one of the main goals of yoga is to bring more of our impulses under control. Like I always use simple examples like, I really want that basket of fries, but oh, my yoga practice tells me to check that impulse because I'm going to feel bloated afterward. You know what I mean? Like simple stuff like that, yoga is helping us with all the time. But as we practice more and more, whether it's meditation or asana or the different sort of forms of yoga that we have, the goal is to see larger sort of structures of our life come under the more mindful guidance and control of a higher self, of a sense of being a spirit soul that's eternal with a different set of priorities than just eating that huge pizza that we want to eat, or spending the money that we quickly want to spend on something that we don't really need, or whatever the case might be. So that, in some ways, that's the foundational element of yoga, is let's figure out how to control our minds a little bit more and to control those impulses, which can lead to a redefining of happiness. And the basic conclusion of the Yoga Sutras in many ways is that the not only is the mind and the body looking for peace and greater contentment, but actually the thing that really defines human life is the search for happiness. That we're all that's where those desires and impulses come from. Is like, how could I be happy today? How could I be happy in this moment? And one of my bhakti teachers likes to say that, we're like cell phones that have the Wi-Fi signal turned on, and we're always looking for a signal to connect to. And it could be spending 20 minutes on a website that will do nothing for you. And that'll occupy 20 minutes, and you'll attach to that signal. And then it could be the next thing you're going to attach to is Netflix. And then the next thing is your cell phone. And then the next, you see what I'm saying? It just goes like that, on and on and on. In yoga, usually people are coming to yoga because they're saying, I'm looking for a permanent signal. You know what I mean? Like, I'm looking for, or at least something that's more stable. I'm looking for something that won't end. Something that won't drop, the signal won't drop off. Like, for example, when I was younger, I was addicted to cigarettes for a couple of years of my life. Nothing real, bad, I guess. And then some other things too. And very quickly, one of the things that helped me rid myself of that habit, you might say, was some of the first yoga classes I took. First of all, it's really hard to breathe if you're doing yoga, and smoking is very difficult. But also just some of the things that I heard yoga teachers talking about with regard to that won't make you, the things that we get attached to don't make you happy for very long. Or you'll need more and more and more of the same thing, but it'll do less and less and less for you. And so yoga begins in many ways, not just with control the mind, but also you can't control the mind without reorienting it towards something higher. So it's not enough, for example, to tell my daughter when she wants a cookie and she's going to have a tantrum if I take it away from her once she's got it in her hand. It's much easier if I replace it with something else. Do you know what I mean? If I say, hey, how about this other option? We're all like that. If someone says no to us, we get upset. But if someone says, here's a healthy alternative, or here's a few healthy alternatives that you could do right now, the little kid in us is still like, oh, I can still do something. Okay. Because that's like our basic MO is like, what can I do that will actually make me happy? So yoga is not really fundamentally about zeroing out into just negating things and sort of trying to come to a zero point. At a critical juncture in the Yoga Sutras, the Patanjali talks about absorbing ourselves in actual personal love for the deity. And this is actually like talked about in, I believe the Sanskrit, I'm going to mess this up, but it's an Ishta Devata, which means like your personal relationship to the deity. This would be like a statue or something like that you might actually fix your attention on in meditation with love in your heart. Like I love, in the Krishna Bhakti tradition, for example, you fixate on Krishna and Radha, which is sort of like the masculine, feminine counterparts of God. And you fixate on them while you're meditating and get your heart attached to love directed in that way. Because it's not thought to be enough, even in the Yoga Sutras, where meditation is a very austere path, very different than Bhakti, but it's still, the point is not to just zero out. You have to develop, in order to be absorbed in meditation, you have to direct your attention to something that can absorb it, that can take it in. Your signal has to attach to something. So a lot of the times in yoga, again, people come in with the misconception that I have to be good at meditating, and I can't be good at meditating because I can't empty my mind. Well, that would be really impossible, and it's the same reason that none of us likes having a cookie taken away without a healthy alternative given to us instead. It's hard to just reject cookies unless you develop a taste for vegetables. It's that kind of a logic that's at play. So if we say basically that yoga is teaching us how to learn how to control the mind and control the body and the senses, but it's also teaching us how to attach to a higher signal. And that signal is in the heart. It lives in the heart, and it's part. We always talk about there's an outer yoga with the postures, but we emphasize how important it is for the yoga. The real yoga is happening inside in the heart. So yoga might tell you externally, you got to get rid of the noise. You got to get rid of the static. There's too much clutter in your house, or there's your diet's not regulated enough. You need to eat more regularly because your blood sugar is getting messed up. So yoga can kind of like rectify and help you get things under control. most people don't want to be like a controlled, regimented person. Do you know, you know what I mean? Like people drop out of classes really quickly if it's just about regimen. So you need something for the heart. And that's what yoga is teaching us, in addition to learning how to control things like breath and body and everything else. What does that have to do with astrology? Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the word vritti, which refers to the turnings of the mind. I heard another monk, Hridayananda Das Goswami, who's has a wonderful series on the Yoga Sutras from a kind of bhakti standpoint. Really brilliant series. And in fact, if you're interested in that, do you guys have a class Dropbox folder? No. If you're interested in it, you can email me and I will give you a link where you can listen to the whole series, because it's just really like a really deep, uplifting take on the Yoga Sutras. It's called, well, I don't know the name of the series. I just have it at home in my folder, and it's a series by a guy named Hridayananda Das Goswami.
Ashley has an email for all of us.
Yes, yes. And if I forget, will someone remind me? Because in the stream of this talk, just please someone send me a little reminder, and then I'll email everyone with it. Okay. I know by now, I know to just tell people, like, email me a reminder, because or when especially when I'm teaching. Okay, so the word vritti, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, H.D. Goswami, who's an amazing Sanskrit scholar, he talks about the etymological connections to the Greek language, and that word vritti shares in common with some of the ancient philosophers and astronomers in Greek the word for revolutions in the sky, the revolutions of the planets turning in cycles over and over and over again. So the word vritti, the turnings of the mind, in the Yoga Sutras itself has an actual etymological connection to the turnings of the sky, the turnings of all the planets in the sky. So why make that connection? Because in many ways, what the birth chart represents, like this that you're looking at right now, this is just a chart of the sky right now. I believe it's current. Yeah, it's pretty current. Anyway, a picture like this is showing us, okay, here's all the planets. Here's where they are in the sky. Here's where they're moving. Let me give you a little physical orientation here. See this. Right? Oh, good. It went away. Okay, so this right here, this degree and this line, this is the eastern horizon. If you draw a line straight across the chart, sorry, I'm not a great drawer with this tool, but you draw a line straight across, this is the western horizon, and this is the eastern horizon. Okay. So everything that's on the top half of this chart that you're looking at represents planets right now in New York, New York City, that are on the, I don't know how to get rid of this little thing. No, close that. Sorry, guys. Right, there we go, get rid of that. Everything that's on the top half of this chart right now is in the visible sky from horizon to horizon in New York City. So it's basically us in DC too. Everything that's on the bottom half of the chart, all the little glyphs you see, are the planets where they're located on the other side of the planet, their view of the night sky right now. Because it's daytime over here, it's nighttime over there, so you can think of it like that. So it's like on the other side of the Earth, that's what they're looking at, everything that's down here in this area of the chart. So we're looking at this right now. See, here's the sun. Where is it heading? Heading down toward the west, right? It's going to set down here at this line. That's where it'll set. It rose over here, right? So we know that if the top of the chart is like basically this little degree, the MC, in this place called the 10th house, that's the top of the sky, like high noon, basically. So this is giving you a physical orientation of the sky. And a birth chart is nothing more than a picture at the moment you were born that's artificially frozen in time that depicts where everything is from the location of your birth at the time of your birth. And what you'll see here is you have those numbered pieces of pie. And the numbered pieces of pie are called houses. And houses are basically just sections of the sky. So you see, for example, this section right here is just above the eastern horizon. This one's further up. This is high noon. This is just starting to move into the west, starting to set. This is further down in the west, and then this is finally the western horizon. So the houses are just breaking up planets into different chunks in the sky, and then they go around on the other side of the Earth, at the bottom half of the wheel as well. Every house in ancient astrology was home to one of the 12 zodiacal signs of the zodiac. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then the planets are moving through those signs out in space as they orbit around the sun. The rotation of the Earth on its axis thus carries the planets and signs of the zodiac through the perspective of the horizons that we see. So the Earth just keeps rotating on its axis 24 hours a day. And you can see right here, like right this little planet, this means that right now, as I cast this chart, Jupiter is preparing to rise into the sky. All the way up here, the moon has already risen into the sky, Venus is in the sky, Mercury's in the sky, the sun is in the sky, leading the procession, so to speak. And then this will go down and set, Mercury will follow it, all these planets will continue wheeling through the sky going down this way. Does that make sense? So that's a 24-hour procession, just day after day, it's spinning like that. So you can see that the reason that the Yoga Sutras makes a connection to those revolutions, those turnings of the mind, and in a sense there's an etymological kind of connection to the revolutions of the planets in the sky, is because the sky keeps turning. And all of these different objects in the sky keep moving in patterns. Round and round and round it goes. And what does the mind do? The same thing. Does that make sense to everyone? Is that a very basic connection? So the mind is always moving, the body is always moving, the ecology of the earth and the seasons are always moving, the heavens are always moving, everything is always moving like that. And so in what do the Yoga Sutras say? Yoga is the cessation of the turnings of the mind, the revolutions of the mind. So astrology, similar, is a science that gives us something like a map of the psyche, the mind, a map of the soul and its incarnation and its karma, meaning the things that it's here, your destiny path, the things that you're here to experience as a soul in a particular body. And this map of the sky at the moment of birth is giving us some sense of some orientation as to how your mind is, how your character and behavior and psychology is, and what the nature of your dharma is, your destiny path, your duties in life that you'll have in different areas, your gifts, your challenges. It's all sort of there. So that's the basic thing. But think about it for a second. It doesn't look very hopeful for astrology and yoga to work together if the goal of yoga is to stop these turnings, right? And what does that say about astrology? Well, how fruitful is it to go and get interested in astrology if all this is going to do is wrap you up in the drama of your life and your, all this stuff? You know what I mean? Like, and so for so many people, not to be judgmental, but for many people who pick up a random newspaper horoscope and it's 2 sentences long, it's a kind of a glorified fortune cookie of some kind. Astrology is nothing more than a way of, kind of thinking about yourself and creatively, or thinking about your life and what's going to happen to me. But in that sense, it's like, kind of feels maybe like it's like a spiritual gossip column. Do you know what I mean? Like if from the standpoint of yoga, if we're trying to not get wrapped up in all the drama of our minds and our lives and get lost in it, you can see how astrology could very easily, because it's actually mapping out all of the fluctuations, the chitta-vrittis of the mind and of life and of karma and of the world. If it's mapping those things out, then getting into it would, instead of saying let's still the cessations of the mind, it would be like saying that sounds like a cool merry-go-round. Let's go play in that. Let's get wrapped up in that. So we have to really distinguish why we're doing astrology. And as students of yoga, it is absolutely not to get more wrapped up in or lost in the kind of dramas of our life that aren't productive or healthy. How many of you, like when you get on your yoga mat and you're doing a practice, it feels good because you can leave all that stuff behind for a little bit. and just get back into some element of yourself that's timeless, that's eternal. And that's what we, that's why we do yoga, to drop into the heart and to drop it. We're looking for that signal, something that we are, that's bigger than just the difficulties we're having at work, or the challenges of the world, or, the challenges of our family, or whatever they might be. They're real challenges. It's not to say, not to dismiss the challenges of life, but it is to say that most of us do yoga because if you get overly identified with them, it really spins us out. It really spins us out. So yoga chitta vritti nirodha, yoga is the cessation of the turnings of the mind stuff. So similarly, astrology at its core, its ancient philosophical roots are all about helping us to understand the nature of the mind, of dharma, of destiny, of karma, specifically so that we have forewarned is forearmed, so that we can go through the destiny of our life with equanimity. So well, this period of time might be a little difficult for finances, but you know what? In 2 years, there's a more favorable period. You get that kind of perspective with astrology, and it helps you to take with the good with the bad in kind of equal stride. That's the real heart of ancient astrology, because we see ancient astrologers in India, it's closely tied to yoga. And in the West, it's closely tied to things like Platonism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, Hermeticism, all flavors of mysticism that emphasized equanimity in the face of the constant dramas and of the world and the constant fluctuations of the mind. So they all have that in common on some level or another. So what I want to show you now is specifically how astrology, how the very fabric of the astronomy that gave rise to astrology reflects the similar philosophy of the Yoga Sutras. So I'm going to turn now to, let's see, here we go. We're going to open up an astronomy program that I have. It's a really cool program called Starry Night Pro. It's pretty cheap. I think it's like, especially if anyone's interested in studying astrology more. Studying astrology without some knowledge of astronomy is it's really sort of, you get so stuck in your head. It's so helpful to try and make something of it more physical and embodied. So knowing that, getting a little bit of the actual astronomy is helpful. And I apologize to people out in virtual land who have to stare at a picture of me and my family, but I'm trying to get this program started, but it's not responding. We'll just give it a second. I know, I hate forcing people to look at cute things for too long. Sorry. All right, let's see. Well, okay, thank you. All right, let's see. Oh, here we go. Okay, great. All right. So for ancient astrologers, their ancient astrology comes about not long after the Persian occupation of Babylon, which takes place through the middle of the 6th century BCE. And during that time, there was a great confluence of scholars and mystics and astronomers and astrologers meeting in the Persian courts from both the East and the West. Not long before that, trade routes were greatly expanding all across the Mediterranean, also allowing the culture of astral omen divination to flourish all over the civilized world, that area. Northern Africa, Mediterranean, Greece, sort of the beginnings of the Roman Empire, expanding out through the Mesopotamian region over to India. Similarly, during the last 500 years BCE, you also see, for example, the I Ching being developed in ancient China. So at any rate, the I Ching as an oracular device, because it was actually a very old scriptural type of text prior to becoming a diviner's manual. Anyway, there's a great proliferation of this kind of divination that's rooted in the sky. And then in the astrologers that are meeting from the east and west during that Persian occupation, there's also around that similar time historically, see the great proliferation of Greek philosophers like Heraclitus and Pythagoras and Plato and Socrates, and that whole wave of thinkers that had such a profound impact on the trajectory of like Western civilization. Not all good. I'm not trying to glorify anything here, but that's just kind of the trajectory of it historically. I'm going to put in the ecliptic now, so you can see the ecliptic, and I'm going to put in the planets, and we're going to put in the zodiacal constellations, and we're going to put in their labels. So, and then I'm going to back this up a little bit. I know it's hard to see in here because of the light quality, but you should be able to start to see that. Can you kind of see the constellations there? Okay, so this is the basic view of the sky. What we're going to do now is try to explain the way in which this great confluence of Eastern and Western thinking, especially through the lineage of Platonic thinking in the West, was intimately tied to the foundational sort of mystical astronomy of astrology. So that's a mouthful, but you'll be able to follow along with it pretty easily in a second here. So first of all, there's a great text by Plato called Timaeus. And Timaeus is a text where Plato sort of lays out a great cosmology, which is a basic picture of reality and how reality is constructed, and it's sort of trying to lay it out. He says at the beginning, this is a sort of mythological take, and so he's presenting a kind of model, and in that model, he suggests that the sky demonstrates for us the structure of reality in the way that it operates. So, for example, he starts with what he calls sometimes called the primary motion of the sky. Here's what the primary motion of the sky looks like. You should all be able to see the sky is now moving. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. The sky is moving, and it's all moving in the same course. Over here, where you see this little hand and pointer finger, this is the east, or due east, and everything is rising there. And everything is moving along that same line up into the sky to high noon, right? Just like I was showing you in the birth chart. And then everything is moving from there to set in the west down there. That's the primary motion. Does anyone know, can anyone remember what that motion is caused by that I mentioned earlier? Rotation of the Earth on its axis. So that's what's causing that motion of everything appearing to move through our perspective in a circle. It appears like we're not moving, right? So that's the basic, that's called the primary motion. Now, notice how everything, all the planets in the sky, even they're all here, but just notice how they all follow that. Do you see any of the planets moving faster than that? Do you see any of the planets moving at all? Not really, right? That's because compared to that, the speed of that motion, the planet's motions out in space are significantly slower. So they're moving in the opposite direction. Case in point, watch this. If I advance this one day at a time to the exact same time of day, now I've hidden the daylight, so it's artificial dark in this program right now, so you can see all the stars and stuff. But if I advance this one day at a time to the same time of day, see how the moon is moving along now? You're going to see other planets gradually moving along, and pretty soon you're going to see how Venus is popping up. There's the moon again. So all of the planets out in space are moving this way through the zodiac out in space. That's their orbit around the sun out in space is moving in the opposite direction that we see them being carried through the sky each day by the primary motion. So their motion is called the secondary motion. So they're being carried this way, much faster than they can overtake. But gradually out in space, they're working their way through the sky in the opposite direction. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so that is Plato called that, also related that to called that the secondary motion. So you have the primary and secondary motion. Now, for Plato, these two motions in Timaeus are intimately related to the basic structure of reality. Here's how that structure is explained. The primary motion that carries everything through the sky, it's the fastest motion, nothing can overtake it, everything is subsumed by it, everything is carried along by it. It's uniform, it's singular, right? Like that he called in relation to the divine, or what some people might call God, or the eternal, or the absolute. Now that is, in, you could say in astronomical terms, the presence of that singular motion sweeping everything up is a display in nature that we can use to intuit the presence of something eternal, something that carries everything together as a singular intelligence, that oneness that sometimes people speak about, or the divine source that everything comes from. Does that make enough sense conceptually to everybody? Regardless of whether you believe any of this or not, I just want everybody to understand, where this comes from. So that is an explanation of the primary motion. Now, the idea in lots of mystical practices is that the material world that we are in here, that we inhabit, is distinctly different from the spiritual realm or the eternal spiritual place. So for Plato, for example, let's use a simple analogy that makes sense for yoga. Most people who practice yoga believe that the body is inhabited by a spirit soul, and that the body is, when the body dies, the spirit soul goes on, whether that's in another body or whether that's returning to God, and you've had previous, in yoga obviously, you've had previous incarnations. Your spirit soul has been in previous forms. So that's a common belief for yogis, pretty common in all spiritual traditions. You have that in Christianity and Islam, and so many different traditions. You have the idea of a spirit soul. In Buddhism, it's a little different, but similar. Some similarities too. Maybe we'll draw those similarities in a minute. But so the material world is inhabited by and reflects the eternal, whether that's the soul and spirit or the consciousness in your body, or whether that is the feeling of a divine presence permeating everything. So though things die and change and come and go in this world, something eternal pervades it, something conscious. And in us, maybe we think of ourselves as spirit souls. Does that make sense to everybody so far? So that realm of coming to be and passing away, where there are seasonal changes, and you take a body and the body ages and gets old and gets disease and dies, or what, that's the progress of life. That process, that material process, is thought of as the realm of time and space, of materiality. And it's thought of in Plato's philosophy as associated with the secondary motion of the planets. Here's why. Because the planets all have their own idiosyncratic natures, cycles, and predictable patterns that they repeat over and over and over again. But what defines them is the cyclical and diverse nature. So just like there are many different human beings, right, in different bodies and different body types, and there's different species of animals and all different, there's diversity everywhere. Similarly, the planets reflect the pantheon of diverse forms. And yet, they all predictably also have their own cycles. A river has a cycle, the clouds and the weather and the jet stream and our bodies and our blood sugar levels at different times of day and our hormones, and everything in the material world is running through cycles like that. And so it's diversity in form and predictable cycles. So the material realm is thought of by Plato more or less to be operating according to predictable cyclical kind of laws of nature, and it also demonstrates great diversity of form. Okay, but for Plato, there's a problem, which is that the great problem of human nature that we started with yoga is similar for Plato. Think about it like this. How many times in life have people suffered by, we think this is yogis, right? By being overly identified with how they look instead of what's in their heart. It's a really simple thing that we all probably agree to as people taking this kind of a class. Every day, people falsely identified with their looks, with their appearance, with how much money they have in the bank, with all different kinds of stuff, are in deep states of suffering because of misidentification. Instead of being identified with their eternal soul and heart, they get lost in this stuff. So that's what we're talking about. So for Plato too, there's a problem, which is how did an eternal spirit soul come to be in the material world where the tendency is to fall asleep and to get falsely identified with things that we are not. How did that happen? And that's the same basic question that so many mystical traditions start with. I'm not a big fan of the idea of original sin, for example, personally, but the Christian mythology of the Garden of Eden is very similar to the basic premise of Platonism and yoga and Buddhism and everything else, which is that we have a little bit of a problem here. And you have to work to stay awake. Do you know what I mean? And because the tendency is for us to sort of fall asleep and get misidentified with stuff. So if that's the problem that we're running into, Plato's cosmology is also trying to explain to us how and why that came to be. So one of the ways he explains this is he says, the material world, which the planets reflect in their cyclical, predictable, and diverse natures, that, remember, what do? They move against the grain of the primary motion. So in some ways, you see the planets as reflective of the tendency to get misidentified with the body and ego and to go against the grain of our eternal nature, to move against that grain rather than going with it. Does that make sense? Okay, so at any rate, Plato equates the realm of the planets and their idiosyncratic natures with the realm of basically lesser knowledge, delusion, ignorance, etc. And for example, very similar way that he relates the secondary motion in Timaeus, or a very similar connection. Another one of his texts is the allegory of the cave. How many of you guys have ever had to read that in a class before? Allegory of the cave. So it's a famous philosophical allegory. In the allegory, Plato depicts a man who's in a cave and he's looking at the dancing shadows on a wall, and he's chained. So he thinks that this is all that there is, and he doesn't even maybe recognize that he's chained, and he thinks that these shadows are what's real. But then, as the story goes on, he gets out of his chains and comes to realize that there's a fire somewhere behind him in the cave that's casting the light and creating the shadows on the wall. So he finds the real source of what he thought was knowledge or reality. He finds the real source of it behind him. Then progressively, he goes out of the cave. And there are many prisoners in the cave, too, who absolutely don't want to be bothered. He cannot convince them for anything that there's actually real light, that you can get out of here, that what you're seeing isn't real. No one will listen. How many of you guys ever felt similarly trying to convince somebody that maybe there's some benefits in yoga? Is it people say like, I don't need to twist myself into a pretzel or whatever, and you're trying like, no, it's actually about getting in touch with your divine self. And people are like, okay, whatever, So similarly, the guy getting out of the cave, he's going to have a hard time convincing other people that it's worth getting out of their chains and checking out the source of real knowledge. But eventually, he actually gets out of the cave itself, and then sees the light of the real world and the real sun, and it goes progressively like that. So it's a very similar trajectory to the spiritual imagination of yoga. The same basic idea that we come into forms, perhaps. And here's the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna addresses why you're here, it's very similar to many other sort of religious stories around the world, which is that you're here because you're an eternal spiritual soul, but you have free will. You chose to come here. You chose to come here. You chose to come into the material world and check it out, and check out what it would be like to be human. And the thought of why you would do that for example, in Bhakti, Krishna Bhakti, which the Bhagavad Gita is a part of, and very similar in Christianity, one of the ideas is that the soul desires to live in a sort of separative state, as if it's autonomous, rather than being a part of a loving, blissful, eternal congregation of souls and God in a divine realm. And that it desires to have a sort of more, the illusion of being a more separate, autonomous entity. And that ultimately, though, this desire is honored by allowing us to come to a realm that God, in fact, creates like a virtual reality machine, and allows us to come here and do it, after a while, the soul gets lost in it. And then the education of the soul happens when we start saying, maybe I liked hanging out in the concert halls in a spiritual place, or something like that, you know, hanging out with my fellow jivas, my fellow souls, and, you know, and the divine infinite source or whatever, in this loving exchange. Now that's Krishna Bhakti, very similar in Christianity. Of course, there are many other paradigms. For example, in Buddhism, it's not so much that you have a spirit soul or that there's a personal God, as much as it is that this place is similarly thought of as, on some level, illusory, and you're trying to go beyond it, but what's beyond it you can't speak of. It's not conceptualized in the same kind of personal soul, personal God, something like that. Those are different options out there, but many mystical traditions, the point is, start with the same basic premise, that we get falsely identified very easily with material reality. We're like locked into this tendency to be asleep here. So probably you guys have all heard something like this before, right? This is okay. So this is, you know, this is the Yoga Sutras for sure. So in Timaeus, we have this depiction of reality as structured in this particular way. You have the primary motion of the sky, depicting the divine eternal realm, and the planets, which are part of that. And so the planets have the power to reflect something divine and eternal, but they also, their duty is also to reflect the material world that the divine eternal souls or sparks of consciousness are inhabiting. So that's I know that philosophically that's like kind of dense, right? But that actually is exactly what we have at work here. When we look at a birth chart, now what are you seeing? What you're seeing is the idea that the planets in the sky, reflecting all of these different idiosyncratic turnings of environment, of the material world and all of its changes, can symbolically reflect, in sometimes very general terms and in sometimes more specific terms, the unique situation that you find yourself in, the unique point of the material river of time and space that you entered in at when you were born. And it gives you a sense of where your life is heading, of what your behavior is like, what your material form is like. Remember, both the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita, two great texts of yogic history, tell us that from your psychology to your behavior, your subtle body, you know, your mind, all of these things are all temporary. They're all thought of as something that you'll shed when you die. And so all of this is a part of the vehicle that we're in. And this charts the great, you know, sort of hypothesis of this form of divination is that the sky and its predictable turnings can speak to the eternal soul about its temporary situation. So that's the basics of the connection between ancient yoga philosophy and the astronomy that is the foundation of astrology. Is that any questions about that so far? Yeah, so what I've just presented is a connection, for example, between yogic philosophy, that first line of the Yoga Sutras, and the goal of yoga, and the basic way that the astronomy of astrology mirrors that same philosophy. So the entire way that we end up conceptualizing about how to read all of this information is based on the continuing dynamic of the primary and secondary symbolism of spirit and matter, or of that which is sort of divine and eternal, and that which is temporal or temporary. So, for example, when you look at the houses, they all have meanings. The meanings of the houses, as I teach this in my programs in depth, we don't have time today, but the meanings of the houses are all derived from understanding the interaction between the primary motion of the sky and the secondary motion of the planets in different parts of the sky. I'll give you a simple example. Okay, this one's kind of fun. I just did this at a conference. So this house right here at the very bottom of the chart, when planets reach this portion in the sky, they have gone all the way from, they begin to rise right here. Does that make sense? You can see they're at the bottom, and then here they begin to rise. And then they go all the way around the wheel, and they come back down. So this place was called the beginning and end of all things. Makes sense now why? Because this is where everything starts off rising from and where it comes back to. Now, what does that mean practically? Well, the beginning and end of all things is kind of an esoteric statement, but it breaks down into other things like your family, your roots, your home, your parentage. Why? Because that's where you came from, and that's where you return to. At the end of every day, where do you go? You go back home. Where do you start every day at? Home. See what I'm saying? So the motions of the sky in this place generate the topics that are associated in divination with this part of the chart. So planet in this portion of the chart would tell us something about home, family, property, roots, ancestral karma, but other things too. Minerals that are buried beneath the earth, things that are mined, precious metals, stuff like that, because it's all the way down below the earth. It's also associated with mysteries and things that are buried or hidden or out of sight. Why? Because it's the deepest, darkest part of the chart. When the sun is here, it's the darkest part of night. It's like, so all of the natural motions of the sky are generating topics that we end up reading symbolically in the chart in order to read a person's destiny or karma or what have you. And it gets very elaborate and complex when you start combining this, all the house meanings, with all of the planetary meanings, with the dynamics of where a planet is at in its cycle. Is Venus an evening star? Is it a morning star? Is she in a masculine fire sign or a feminine water sign? All sorts of layers of language start emerging, but they all end up being based on the same thing. Now, the primary motion of the sky defines the topics of this house.
And that's the fourth house?
That's the fourth house, yep. So let me show you an example now of how secondary motion and primary motion combine to form the meaning of the fifth house. The angular houses 1, 4, 7, and 10, like the four cardinal directions in a ceremony. They're the powerhouses. They're very, you have planets in there. They were among other things by ancient astrologers, they were said to be like centers, like they're called kentrons in the Greek, but it means they were centers or hubs of dynamism and activity. So when a planet's in that place, it's greatly empowered because it's taking a critical turn. In the fourth house, the planet has reached its low point, its end, but also its beginning point. So it's the end and beginning. Here, the planet is rising into the visible sky. So it's taking a critical turn because it's appearing for the first time in visible sight. Here, the planet is reaching the high point of the sky, culmination, achievement, accomplishment, kings, rulers, queens. You get down to the seventh house, the planet is setting. And there's a whole set of very interesting topics I won't go into because they're a little bit more complex. It's associated with the seventh house and the relation to setting. One of them is marriage, and another one would be worship of the gods. But at any rate, so those four houses are very powerful and their meanings are derived from the primary motion, meaning what is happening when a planet is carried by that singular unified cyclical motion day in and day out to these four places. And the topics are generated from that. That's the primary motion. Then there's this, but notice how the primary motion only makes sense by juxtaposition to four angles within a circle that it's repetitively moving through. So those four cornerstones of the chart are thought to be like stakes on a giant cosmic tent that are allowing the world of materiality to have some relation to eternity.
And what are the four?
1, 10, 7, and 4. So you think of 1, 10, 7, and 4, it's like, think if you had a circle moving round and round with no reference points. Do you know what I mean? That's kind of the vision of eternity. but if you see a circle that has reference points, well, here it's doing this. You know what I'm saying? Like in relation to a cross, the cross of matter, the cross of the sky, the horizons, the meridian. It relates to that cross of matter and becomes embodied. And the 4 cardinal points are all defined by primary motion. Then when you go into the other houses that flank the angles, like 5 and 3, for example, flank house 4. So how does, what are the topics of the other houses? Well, a planet, for example, in the 5th house. 5th house was related to topics like children, pregnancy, but also related to creativity, the arts, fun, joy, celebration, going out to a restaurant for a nice dinner or something, like joy and pleasure and recreation, creativity as well, and performance, and then again, children and pregnancy. So this house, the planet that's in this house, let's back this chart up a moment so you can actually see what it would look like if a planet were in this house. I'll back it up by an hour. Okay, so now you see, here's Mars in the 5th house. Mars in the 5th house has a very interesting set of motions that it's participating in. By secondary motion, by primary motion, excuse me, Mars is being brought down here. Right? It was up here in the western sky, remember, and then it was brought down below the earth, and it's coming all the way down to this place, the end and beginning of all things. What will it do right after it finishes in this place? Anyone remember? It'll start to rise again. Right, exactly. So you got that. And now that's where Mars is heading. That's where Mars is being brought, regardless if it wants to go or not. That's where it's going. But does Mars want to go in that direction? No. Remember we said the planets are moving against the grain of that primary motion. Where does Mars want to go? Mars has its sights by secondary motion set on moving from Aquarius toward the sign of Pisces, which is in this house. So its intentionality is aimed away from, turned away from, or just not aware of the fact that it's being brought down into the underworld and roots of the chart. Does that make sense to everybody? So this is why, for example, one of the classic things that was said about the 5th house by Manilius, who's a famous astrologer poet of his book Astronomica, which is very comes from the 2nd century AD, if I remember correctly. He said, not as of yet, he's talking about a planet in the 5th house, does it feel the weight of the world, but it will inherit it in time. That's the gist of it. It's not an exact quote, but what does that mean? Well, it means that the planet is not, it's because it's turned away from, imagine right now, like I'll just stand up. Imagine that I want to go that way. That's the way I want to go, but a force greater than me is just tractor beaming me that way, right? So in a sense, it's like I'm not aware of where I'm going. You see what I'm saying? I'm like, you can see it that way. Either that or I don't want to go that way. I want to go this way. So it's either willful resistance, defiance, aversion to where the planet is being brought, or it's ignorance of where it's being brought, or unconsciousness of where it's being brought. So you can think of that 5th house planet as not understanding the place it's going toward or not wanting to go toward that place. Well, the 5th house, the joy of Venus, likes to hang out and party, likes to go to the theater, likes to, go out for food, likes to dance, likes to celebrate. Right? We all do. This sounds pretty good, right? I think that's where we're going to leave early today so we can get out in the sun a little bit. We're like, hey, joy of Venus, let's do it. Let's go out and have some fun. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, one of the things that's a little confusing to me, I noticed that you went back in time just an hour, and that changed what was actually in.
That's right.
Right? But when you go back, so what is your birth chart like your anchor? Like is that your foundation?
Yeah. Think about it like
then life happens after.
Yeah. Basically, a birth chart. First of all, everyone has to remember that a birth chart is like the runes. Someone's casting runes at the time of your birth or tarot spread. Mm-hmm. This tarot spread just happens to be in the sky. But it's just you're pausing the tarot spread at a given moment and being like, what does that tarot spread look like when I was born? Yeah. That's it. It's not. So I tell that to people to remember that this is also better than thinking of this as something that's going to cause everything that happens in your life through some kind of celestial rays, that it's more like a symbolic mirror in the sky. In the same way that you wouldn't cast a tarot spread and be like, oh, the judgment card, that's going to cause me to have a difficult experience. The card isn't what's causing you to have the experience. The card just mirrors something that's going to happen. It's a symbolic mirroring, right? No one would be like, the card's actually causing something to happen. Similarly, we should think of astrology in that way, in my opinion.
So, okay, so just one more question about the birth chart. So let's say at a hospital, we have 3 babies that are born on the same day at the exact same time.
Yeah, classic
Their
question.
charts would not be the same.
That's right, right. The charts would not be the same. Let me pause on that question so I can finish talking about the 5th house, then I'll come back to it. So, okay, so the planet in the 5th house is aimed at Pisces. It wants to go in that direction, but it's being brought against its will, or it's unaware of the fact that it's being dragged down. What was the 4th house? 4th house, ancestral karma, right? The weight of the world, the eternal base of the chart. It's the place, in a sense, where the soul is, the real substance of the soul is judged in the afterlife, you could even say. It's a place where the soul dies and is reborn into a new form. So not as of yet does the 5th house planet feel the weight of the world, or know that it's marked out for another term of toil. When you're out drinking at the bar, are you thinking about the fact that this may have a ramification on your next life? Do you know what I mean? Like, no one's thinking about that for the most part. Not that you should always be in some somber place either, but when a lot of the times the 5th house, the archetypal nature of the 5th house is such that if you're going to have a good time, you have to forget about work. If you're going to have a good time and go out to the theater, you have to suspend reality for a moment to enter into Jurassic Park. Do you know what I mean? So the 5th house, similarly, the themes, all the themes of creativity, performance, etc., is in some ways has to be symbolized by something that is turned away from a deeper reality, or a more basic reality that in time it will have to wake up toward. You have to leave the theater. You have to face the music karmically. You can't be a kid forever. Children are part of the 5th house. Pregnancy, children. You know, I know this firsthand, seeing my daughter. She will in time come to inherit the family karma. And not all of it, but elements of mom and dad we pick up on. So similarly, the fate of your family karma is in the 4th house. Well, the 5th house is all fun and joy and kids and pregnancy and stuff like that, but it's moving to inherit the weight of the world. So that's how we get that. So here's the primary and secondary motion interacting. Similarly, in the 5th house, sometimes people go to excess. Like, you'll see people in the 5th house that gamble or that drink or that do things that look like it's in the name of fun, but eventually they got to pay the piper karmically for. The trajectory of 5th house karma and topics are fun and beautiful and maybe a necessary distraction from reality. But in time, it becomes heavier. The reality sinks back in. Now, the 5th house also, for example, just to give you some examples of people born with planets in the 5th house that are really prominent, how about Steven Spielberg? Steven Spielberg starts off with Jaws, E.T., right? Adventure, kids' movies. And as a kid, he was really, really creative. Where does he evolve over in time as a creator? Amistad, Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List, like in time, his creative work becomes more mature. Bruce Springsteen, he starts off, I always say this, he starts off a bubblegum smacking, knife fighting boardwalk Jersey kid, muscle cars and all of that. He ends up as an activist in support of Native American rights and women's rights and so many other things. His artwork matures in time. Yoko Ono, prominent 5th house. But so many others I could give you. But there's J.R.R. Tolkien. Great. You guys know Tolkien? Oh. A person meaning a person who was born with a prominent set of planets or planet in that 5th house. These are the kinds of lives or karmas they might live.
And that's the planet in birth.
5th house in the birth chart. Yeah, if they had like a sun or a moon or a stellium of planets or something like that, the ascendant ruler. So at any rate, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Middle Earth and the Hobbits and all of that. Who are the Hobbits? They're little children, basically, who are innocent, but they inherit the ring and the weight of the world. Same thing. When he was a kid, he had both of his parents die early, fought in World War I, and basically had a lot of dreams sort of creatively bombarded by reality. And he ended up representing that loss of childlike innocence in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Fifth house guy, fifth house son. So similar. So that's how we end up reading the karma / dharma, the fate as well as the calling of the soul. Okay, so that gives you a sense, just so you know now, that I'm not just making some, isn't it, this beautiful connection between primary and secondary motion, but no. This primary and secondary motion and the philosophy therein is woven throughout every single piece of astrological theory. From the way the planets work and are differentiated from one another, to the way that the houses are defined, to the way that aspects are understood, meaning geometric shapes, like I'll show you this. If the planets also have relationships to each other in astrology. So if I show you the aspect lines, see all of those? Those are all different kinds of geometric relationships, angles that the planets have to one another. They're thought of as lines of sight. So the ancient astrologers thought in many ways of these planets as gods or demigods or emissaries of God, and they're in a cosmic courtroom. And the way that they are witnessing one another from different places means that each planet and each place bears testimony to different topics in your life. So for example, here's Mars in the fifth house, right? Let's say this had something to do with children. Well, it means something that Jupiter, right here in the second house, which is a house of money, for example, is in a square, which is a 90-degree angle, to that Mars. That means if I was reading something about Mars and the topic of children in a person's life, I would have to say that the god Zeus or Jupiter has expert eyewitness testimony to provide on that topic of children. And he's doing so from the house of money, which means it will also involve something about money. So the cosmic courtroom of ancient astrologers basically was configured in a way where it wasn't just reading one little topic at a time. All of the planets were also like, you could isolate a topic and then see which all the rest of the planets would add their 2 cents to come to bear on the topic to make it more sophisticated and complex of an interpretation. And all of this keeps stringing back to the basic division between primary, secondary, primary, secondary. It was very like the I Ching, if you've ever checked out the I Ching. Every stage of the 64 stages of the I Ching reflect different unfoldings of the Tao in creation. And what is the Tao? Fluctuations in the material space. It shows up as fluctuations between different combinations between yin and yang. 2 separate motions, 2 separate energies like that. What is yoga? What does the word yoga mean? To yoke, to bring together, like religion, to reunite things that have been separated. You guys all get in the ballpark. It's all the right answer here. So similarly, we see in the entire way that the symbolic language of astrology is construed, a deeper desire to work with 2 contrary energies and talking about how they might be yoked together. The whole language is made from their yoking. I know that might sound a little abstract, but hopefully at least giving you a little sample of the fifth house and how the topics are generated just by looking at the complexities of an object moving one way while something's bringing it the other way. Those 2 motions combine to give you this whole set of topics, and that you can actually read that in terms of the karma of a person's life is just mind-blowing, and it's very accurate. So earlier today, or yesterday, I sat down with a woman just to give you a sense of what you're capable of, what this is capable of. Sat down with me I've never met before, and I was able to say very quickly, I bet you're a designer and that your husband, that you married up, or that your husband has a very nice income. Right? Because I was able to see that in the chart right away. Yeah, she's an interior designer and her husband has a very lucrative career. Very, very easy to see that from the chart. Yeah, I don't ever any longer. I don't do charts in class because it takes too long and it ends up being too superficial. So, but in just to give you a sense, like within 5-10 minutes of sitting down with someone I never met, I can be like, oh yeah, you're something art and design, and your husband's really wealthy, and like I can see that very, very quickly. And there's lots of other things too. Just not too long ago, had someone sit down with me who was becoming a student of mine. and a private student. And the very beginning of the session, she had an eclipse happening right on her marriage line. And I said, are you with anyone? This was just, I was gotten together with her as teacher student about maybe a month after this happened. I said, are you with anyone? Big event, your marriage relation? No, I'm not with anyone. I was like, oh, well, you got something big coming in marriage and relationship. She was like, I don't think so. I haven't dated for a while, etc. Oh no, she met someone, fell in love, and is already on the path to getting married. And that was just September, right? So that astrology's it's a very legitimate form of predictive divination. And all of the theory of it keeps coming back to that same primary, secondary. Now, let's take that forward. Now let's jump forward to the next piece, which is, okay, so astrology can predict things, and you've just seen a little glimpse of some of the logic, and hopefully you're just getting like a glimpse or an impression of how some of this works. You're like, okay, I kind of get it, I see, but then we have to come back to, how do you utilize this for the sake of yoga? So great, you can predict stuff, but didn't we start off by saying that we shouldn't get overly attached to our lives and drama? And isn't it just so much smoke and mirrors to be able to say you're a designer, your husband makes a lot of money? At the end of the day, do I want my client as a yogi astrologer to really base their self-worth on their career as a designer or their husband's money? Do you know what I mean? No, that's not at all. I mean, I'm not saying that those are bad things at all either. No judgment toward them. But no, I want her to tap into her heart, and I want her to find happiness. Because what happens in the material world? Husband could lose money. God forbid, husband could pass. Things like this happen. For 8 years now, I've been a full-time astrologer. And I can tell you that nobody is ever ready for loss and impermanence. Do you know what I mean? One of my favorite teachers told the story of how his sister was a very successful professor, was tenured, wrote books, and said all this. On the day of her retirement, she got the results back from some lab testing. She was dealing with some abnormal stuff, had 4 months to live. Found that out on the day of her retirement. What was her first response? She said to one of my teachers, who's a monk, she said, this wasn't what I was expecting. You know what I mean? And we never are. Astrology can never, in a sense, deliver to you the experience of meeting with good things or bad things in life. You're still going to be elated if you get a raise. You're still going to be devastated if you lose someone. So that's what I was saying earlier. Like, astrology isn't there to just like say, oh, here's where everything's heading, so you can get really, jazzed up about the good stuff, really freaked out about the bad stuff. Now, for the whole history of astrology, is that always the way that astrology has been used with this some deeper spiritual sense? No, of course not. It has a long history of being used for something in India they call karma kanda, which is just, in a sense, it's at its best, karma kanda is sort of like being intelligent before you invest in the stock market. You want to have the right timing, hit the market at the right moment. You want to use knowledge and information the best you can to navigate. So that's karma kanda in its sort of best sense. But at its worst sense, karma kanda is where you're like superstitious or even it's like a gossip column. I don't know what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. When I sit down with people and they get into a session, I say 50% of people, it's very human, so I don't mean to belittle it at all. It's very human. You get into a session and what do you want to know? It's not, I'd like to know, what's going to happen in what areas so that I might be prepared in heart, mind, spirit to move through these things with equanimity. I want to know what's going to happen with this or with that because I'm in total anxiety over it because that's what I'm attached to. That's where my signal is hooked in. And so much of the time, astrology is a kind of exercise in trying to address people's concerns about their karmic reality. And that's okay. It's part of what astrology has always been used for, sometimes in more helpful ways, sometimes in more harmful ways. Definitely there's a history of people just being like, am I going to meet someone? Like, when will I get a boyfriend? Am I going to get some money? When am I going to be famous? Like, that's really common for people to go to astrology for that kind of stuff. And because astrologers, we make our money you can't, as they say, you can't go broke taking a profit. We're still in the material world. I got a mortgage to pay. I take a lot of clients who those are their concerns. Do you know what I mean? And in that case, the role of the astrologer, in my humble opinion, being a yogi or aspiring to be a yogi as best we can, the role of the astrologer is to try and give someone more than just an answer to their demand or neediness. It's to try and paint a picture of the forecast in a way that describes things that are coming that are both up and down. Because what does that give to a person? What do you guys imagine that would give to a person? Sense of reality, right? Would it balance something that, because in the material world, what happens? Things go up and things come down. And that's what, so in a reading, when someone comes in really needy, the astrologer can try to bring them back to natural intelligence. Natural intelligence, our body and nature. You go camping, you spend a little time in nature away from cell phones and stuff like that, you come back to it really naturally. Things go up and things come down. Your breathing starts becoming more natural. So astrologers are like, you're giving someone a reminder of nature, just what nature is like and how nature flows. And that's a gift that can help someone alleviate stress, not just in terms of giving them the information that they want, but of giving it to them in a way that takes them through ups and downs beyond just the thing that they're attached to. So that's the role of the spiritual astrologer, you might say, dealing with people who are coming in for nothing other than this sort of high-level anxiety, gossip column, that kind of stuff. So similarly, there's a lot of New Age astrology that is rooted in amping people up about their spiritual life. Oh, this transit's coming, it's so transformational, you're going to grow, you're going to die, you're going to evolve, you're going to, like your karma's going to hit the wall. It's a great moment for the acceleration of your spiritual evolution. You guys have heard this before, right? It's like the auctioneers of spiritual evolution, or like many YouTube astrologers that are like this. And that's also, I think we have to be very careful of that, because again, a lot of what that's doing is, for yogis, the idea is that, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, the yogi is someone who is the same, whether it's up or down, whether it's good or bad. We're working for that. So in some ways, when people say, okay, there's going to be this big explosion of family drama, and it's going to give you a chance to really evolve spiritually, right? Oftentimes, what that will create in a person is a kind of, what can you say? They're going to go, you could see them going into that family situation with sort of like guns blazing. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have to handle this family drama in a way that's about my spiritual growth. And how often have you ever met a friend or a family member who's going through something like that, where it becomes like kind of narcissistic? Do you know what I mean? It becomes like it's just about them and their crazy growth, and they're always going through dramas and changes and births and deaths, and they're always going to, So similarly, if astrology is feeding us into that sense of everything always being an exhilarating roller coaster ride of spiritual change, that's not yogic astrology. So it's true that life goes through a lot of changes, and astrology can tell us where things are going to happen in what place. But the mission of a spiritual or yogic astrology is to respond to fate and destiny in the same way at all times, which is with peace in the heart. And that often isn't generated so much in terms of advice that you give someone about how to navigate how to treat or handle their boss so that they can level up spiritually. It's more about how do you practice yoga? And astrology can say, okay, so you're going to have some drama with your boss this year. And they'll say, well, what should I do? Some astrologers might say, like, well, you should really get empowered, own your power and face your boss and da-da-da. And the person does so and they lose their job. Was that good spiritual advice? Now they can't feed their kids? Now that, you know what I mean? So no, that wouldn't be great spiritual advice. The most solid spiritual advice that any astrologer can give is, here's the map, here's the terrain, here's where you're going, and the answer is always the same. Practice yoga. That's not on the birth chart map, right? So similarly, for ancient astrologers, the attitude, whether you're looking at people like Vettius Valens or Ptolemy or Manilius and so forth, Stoic, Platonist, what was their mood about this stuff? When you look at the birth chart is not telling you who you are. It's not telling you what you are as a spiritual being. It's telling you about the life that the spiritual conscious being that you're living is going to move through, is going to experience. And how to relate to that with equanimity in the heart is not a matter of what the chart says. Does that make sense? Very, very important, because in this, again, this is just my opinion, but many ways I see students all the time. They get into astrology and they become identified with their birth chart. I'm a Leo. I'm like this. I've got Sagittarius rising. I've got this planet in this place, or so forth. Now, on some level, self-understanding, taking a Myers-Briggs test, or taking some psychological inventory, getting to know your character, these can be very helpful things. I'm not anti-therapy. I'm not anti-psychology. Anything that can help you understand your quirks and patterns, that can be a part of the practice of yoga, helping you bring yourself on some of the impulses under control, or this kind of stuff is really, really healthy and good. And astrology can be used for that. But to the extent that I can't tell you how many people I see regularly through social media every day when I post my horoscopes, or in my classrooms or my client practice, who get exposed to astrology and then they become identified by it. And the absolute last thing that ancient astrologers had in mind, from everything I've read and seen, as well as yogis, was that one should get identified with stuff, because it's no different than thinking that you are your job, you are your car, you are your money. So for example, Vettius Valens, who was an ancient astrologer, said, paraphrasing again, God gave this science to humankind so that armed with this foreknowledge, one might face the trials and tribulations, the ups and downs, with a kind of disinterest and dispassionate distance. That doesn't mean that you're cold, that you renounce the world, that you hate on things or judge things, or things have to be evil. You still have lives to live, but it's that you remain free while moving through it. Does that make sense? You remain awake and conscious and aware while moving through it. That could mean, okay, think about it, for example, like you imagine Nelson Mandela and having to be in prison for so long. He probably handled, I don't know how he handled it, but he probably handled it by staying very present. How else could you get through something like that? You see the same thing reflected in Holocaust survivors who have written great texts, like Viktor Frankl. Think about him, and how did he survive what was his thought on what he saw in people who were surviving those atrocities. And he said it was that they found meaning, that was really important, but that they also, you can tell throughout that book, which has been a while since I've read it, but you can tell that there's a sense of, I'm independent from what's happening. Do you know what I mean? Like, ultimately and eternally, I don't have to be brutalized or taken away. I'm ultimately free. And when you think the same thing, when you think about people who are suffering all over the world in different situations, and different being a part of different marginalized groups, who were born into all different kinds of karmic suffering, how helpful would it be to tell them, like, well, that's all you are. It's just that's your chart. That's what. But how helpful would it be to tell them, on the other hand, oh, well, there's no reality to all of that. So both extremes are really insensitive. And astrology has always, like yoga, especially you think of especially the Bhagavad Gita text in particular, is saying you're looking to find yourself as an eternally free being, free from all the conditions that you're living in, while not being falsely renunciate of the world either. So it's the same idea that we started with. Astrology is here to teach us by the birth chart about the life we're going to live, so that we can live it with healthy, participatory, and reflective distance. How do we do that? It's not just found in saying, no, that's not who I am, handy to know so that I can renounce it, but it's more about saying, okay, this is the life I'm going to live. Ultimately, that's not who I am. So how do I find a signal? How do I attach my heart to a signal so that I can move through all of it with peace? It's a lot easier to move through it if we know something about the terrain of what we're moving through. That's the basic premise of astrology. And that's how it weds itself to yoga. One of the main ways it was used in the yogic tradition, is still used in India, in some ways unfortunately, but in other ways intelligently, is through arranged marriages. Now, arranged marriages, of course, are really dicey topic, right? But in a sort of ideal Vedic sense, the idea behind astrological pairings of people was to make sure that you had a harmonious household and a harmonious marriage and things like that that are noble. of course, the oppressiveness of arranged marriages and many other aspects of Vedic history in India and things like that are complicated as they are in many parts of the world. And that's something, of course, that we're reckoning with right now through things like the Me Too movement and other historical forces. That it turns out that history also ebbs and flows through different changes, and we can see those changes even reflected in astrology. So there's a whole branch of astrology called mundane astrology that looks at the planets in order to predict what kinds of experiences the collective is having. Like, what are humans doing, right? So like, why are we trumping right now? Like, we're all tripping on a Trump trip right now. You know what I mean? Like, why? And the astrology can inform us of that. Does that mean that it tells us like, well, that Trump isn't real, so I'm just gonna tune out, move to Canada? You know what I mean? Or something. Maybe we should move to Canada. I don't know. But you get the idea. No, it's telling us so we can understand these are karmic dynamics.
Yeah.
This is not who we are, but this is a karmic dynamic, and we have to deal with it. And the best place to deal with it from is not from a place of crazy emotional reactiveness to it. So at any rate, that's the basic idea. So we have to find the signal. And astrology, frankly, to be completely honest, astrology very rarely delivers us the signal. Here's the only way that it can do so, in my opinion. And people who are listening to this later online, or you guys, feel free to disagree with me on this, but astrology delivers the signal in little bits by reminding us that we are a part of a karmic realm, that it's predictable, that it's cyclical, and that we have some separateness from it. And so insofar as when astrology works, it sort of keeps delivering and reinforcing that insight. It's helping us reinforce the reality of the need for yoga. And that's really important. Mentally and intellectually, that's a platform that we can build on. But it can't generate what a good hour of meditation can generate. It can't generate what your mat can generate. Do you know what I mean? Like, it can't deliver what spending an hour with the Bhagavad Gita can generate, generally speaking. Now, some people have been fed so deeply by astrology, including myself on a spiritual level. So I'm not talking about people who may go very deeply with astrology. I'm talking about the average person who has an encounter or a couple of encounters with astrology in their life. It can tell you about the map. It doesn't necessarily bring you to that heart signal. And for that reason, many people in spiritual life you'll see very polarized about astrology. About the history of yoga, in fact, there's many people who say, well, astrology doesn't tune you in to that eternal source in your heart, and so it's just a waste of time. You're just spinning your wheels thinking about your life when you should really just be, meditating. And I have to, of course, spiritually disagree with that, because I'm like, no. I mean, if you couple this with yoga, for many people it becomes a platform for which to help practice the healthy detachment from the things that are coming in different areas of your life. And I think that's really good. So many people are very mental. Many people can't consider the idea of tuning into a divine source in your heart or a spirit in your heart. A lot of people say, you got to convince me of it. I have to be, at the end of the day, there's no level of convincing that leads you to faith, right? At some point, experience will just say, I have faith now in something. A person, a trust in a person. It's intangible when you come to have faith in a person. Similarly, when you come to have faith in the reality of God living in your heart, or the divine, or however we want to talk about it, it's something that in the end, intellectual analysis can only push you gently toward until your heart is finally ready to surrender. But this is what I'm saying, is that many people aren't ready for that surrender, and so they do need philosophy. They do need they need to see, oh my God, astrology works? That's incredible. There's something bigger. There's something out there. You see what I'm saying? So this also has a place in terms of helping a person gradually sort of graduate to the stage where astrology is part of their life, but it's not necessarily the spiritual center of their practice. And I'm very passionate about that, even though I know in saying that I risk coming off as self-righteous too, but I don't mean to do that to like people who are really interested in astrology but don't practice yoga, for example. There's a lot of them in my field. But I also feel like I'm a minister's son. I've got to reach out and be like, guys, It's not just astrology. We got to get on our mats or mindfulness or Zen or something. You got to be something other than just turning our intellectual wheels about this stuff. So that's where I'm coming from. All right, so a few last closing thoughts, and it's 5:15. I promise we'll be out of here by 5:30. So there was a question that came earlier, but I'm forgetting what it was. Remember, I was going to...
Yeah. So one was about the birth chart, and I'm giving an example. So we have 3 babies.
Okay, 3 babies.
Born at the exact same time.
Okay.
Their charts are not the same.
Yes. 3 babies born at the exact same time. Their charts aren't the same. What gives? So the main thing to understand is this. Let's say that you had 3, let's say in this room, you cast a huge tarot spread, big cards the size of these mats in a huge circle. And then you had 3 women come in and give birth in some swimming pools, right? Like right in here, right? And then when they get out of the pool, right, you say, okay, this spread of tarot cards in the circle around you is going to reflect their destinies. Do you see how most of the time, nobody would have a problem understanding how the symbolism of a tarot spread in a circle around 3 different infants could refer to 3 totally different destinies, because the cards are emphasized in different ways depending on each unique soul's stuff that they bring with them. Do you see what I'm saying? So similarly, at the time of birth, the same exact astrology can reflect an almost limitless number of possibilities, because in that, think about in the sky at that time, that's the great tarot deck in the sky. That is reflecting at that, the spread of planets in the sky at any given moment is reflecting not just the births happening at that moment all over the world, but everything else that's happening could possibly be used as symbolic correlate. So astrology is very, very flexible in that regard. And also not just in terms of, it could be the exact same chart and it could be very flexible, but also the same astrology at different parts of the world at different times of the day will look vastly different. So that's the basic answer. Yeah.
So those babies are born in different hospitals in different parts of the world, so they're not all in the same hospital.
Well, okay, if they were born at different parts of the world in different times, they would have very different birth charts.
Right, so if they were born, they could be born in the same hospital.
Yeah.
They were in the same church?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, so let me put it this way. This happens a lot with twins, right? Twins are born at the same time. They will live out archetypally similar frameworks. So for example, I'll give you a simple example. A pair of twins that are in my wife's family have very similar charts, so they have the same transits because they're born back to back. Right? How could they not, right?
Have similar charts.
Well, no, they wouldn't have similar charts, for example, if let's see, this rising sign changes sometimes within 5 minutes or even 2 minutes, the rising sign could change to the next sign, which would create a whole different wheel of houses.
Yeah.
The planets would be in all different houses.
Yeah.
That can happen as quickly as 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But, no, that's fine. But let's say they were born with identical charts, right? Let's just say they come out within a minute or 2 or something like that, which they often do. Same transits are happening. And what you have to remember is that the symbols of astrology are also multivalent. So multivalent means that, okay, have you ever looked at a tapestry and you have some central image and then patterns going out around that are symmetrical? Okay, so think about it like any part of that mandala, right, will have a place in relation to the whole. It's not necessarily the same as the whole thing, but it might see the same pattern reflected on one little arm of it that's in the center. Do you see what I'm saying? So similarly, symbols in astrology work like that. They have seed-like similarities and pattern similarities in the symbols that aren't identical to one another, but that are almost like replicas of one another anyway. So let me give you an example. Look at this planet up here in the 9th house. That's the sun. The sun in the 9th house. The 9th house, I won't explain how we get all these meanings like I did with the 5th, but the 9th house, for example, is a house that pertains to the religious impulse and spiritual matters and philosophical matters and universities and higher education. It also refers to long journeys and foreign places or pilgrimages. all topics contained in the ninth house. The sun in that house one soul, that could mean that they're a university professor. The next soul could mean that they're going to spend their life working for the Peace Corps. It's similar because the topics all range out of there having similar things in mind: universities, foreign places, etc. So two souls born with the sun in the ninth house, like a Gemini, or sun's in Gemini, the sign of the twins, so it's a perfect time to talk about it. But the sun is in Gemini in the ninth house, and then a twin is born with the sun in Gemini in the ninth house. The ninth house is also the house of law. You could have one twin that's a lawyer, and the other twin could be an international diplomat. One twin could be a professor, or one twin could be a bum that travels around the world and just freeloads and is like, I don't want to get a job, I just want to travel. And the other one could be someone who's a college-level physics professor. Do you know what I mean? It's still the sun in the ninth house. So that's what I mean when I say you have a tapestry of patterns in astrology that have similarities in common with one another, underlying things that unite physics professor and world traveler. And for example, in the ninth house, one of the things is about expanding your horizons, whether that's physically or mentally. So the one travels and expands his horizons, the other one expands his mind. So it's like that, where there's underlying unity of symbolism that's always uniting seemingly diverse topics or themes. So that's how you get two twins born at the same time who have the same charts, but who can embody that chart in vastly different ways. And why do they embody them in vastly different ways? Because ultimately they're different souls that come into different bodies with different intentions, different desires. Remember that the core reason that we're thought to come here and have innumerable experiences is because we're trying on what does pleasure or bliss or happiness look like in this realm. And most of us, over time, we start doing yoga, are convinced that we have to be very careful because a lot of these things that we desire end up being pretty treacherous. And so we're trying to reorient our desire to something that somehow takes us back home, or that, at least for some people even within this world, just brings us back into harmony or alignment. So that's the basic idea. I hope this was interesting for anyone. Any final questions? Comments? Let's take three reflections. Three reflections. What did you learn, or what is something you'll take away from this today? When we share reflections, this is something I've learned from one of my teachers too. When we share reflections, the consolidated gems of understanding that are percolating in you right now get distributed through the room. So it's wonderful to just share any just little insights or thoughts that are bubbling in you right now. Let's have three of them, three volunteers.
Just the understanding of the movement through life. It's almost like, flying through space. You be kind of fixated at any angle of plane, and yet, depending on your relationship with the planets, those can all have some influence on you. And so it's very fluid and moving.
Beautiful. So the realization there that I'll share in case you couldn't hear that is the kind of three-dimensional understanding of time and space and all of these movements, and how we enter as souls into different trajectories and planes in relation to those movements, and it somehow comes together to help form the story and like arc of our life. Yeah, that's a beautiful realization. Thank you. Yeah.
For me, you said something that really, really resonated with me. And basically, you were explaining that you can have your astrological chart, and it can give you some insight on some things that you perceive as good or bad. But ultimately, it all comes back to preparing yourself to respond with peace in your heart.
Yeah.
So whether or not it's going this way or that way, ultimately, it's about responding with peace in your heart.
Right. Beautiful. Thank you. I'll repeat that again for the audio. So the realization there was the takeaway of the chart may reflect all different kinds of things that you experience, good and bad, but that ultimately it's about how to move through those experiences and come back to peace and love in the heart. Yeah, thank you. Beautiful realization. And so needed in our world. That's really why we're all here doing yoga, and that's my intention behind why I do astrology too. Any other? Let's take one more. Or if there's more than one more too, that's fine.
I like that you said that the answer is do yoga.
Yeah.
Because I do a lot of yoga.
That's brilliant.
That's good to know.
So the realization there was, I like that you said the answer is, do yoga, do more yoga, because I like to do a lot of yoga. So that's good. And for those out there who aren't into yoga, who are listening, and maybe you're like, I don't have a yoga practice, I'm not in a yoga teacher training program. There are so many ways to do yoga. No, yoga ultimately is not just on the mat. Yoga is your walk in nature. It's your journal. It's your mindfulness. It's your loving preparation of your food. It's the time you need to spend with your kids. It's doing the things that bring you back to the heart. In a sense, ultimately, just connecting to the right channel again, the right connection, the right signal. Anything else?
Thank you.
How do you get your chart read? Yeah. You can, if you want to learn more about studying astrology or the readings that I offer, you can go to my website, which is nightlightastrology.com. Some people say nightlife astrology. I'm like, it's not a dance club. Nightlight astrology. Nightlight astrology.
I read your emails every day, and I think that they say nightlight.
It happens a lot. People constantly come. They say, so I really like your nightlife astrology, and I'm like, yeah, me too. I like the nightlife. No, night light, like a light in the night, like stars in the night. And anyway, you can check it out there. You can get a reading there. I have daily, usually either daily writing or YouTube blogging that I do on the regular transits. And I always try to make it about what's happening, but also kind of coming back to that spiritual message. So that's kind of the gist of what I do. I am about to run a special on, there's 3 eclipses coming up this summer, and I'm doing a mini report. So for those people who look at my website and go like, maybe I can't afford a reading, there's a donation range for the summer eclipse reports. It may give you some things to think about, at least for over the summer months and beyond. And that's a little bit more affordable. And that will be posted on my Facebook and my website. And all the details for how to get a hold of one of those will be going out tomorrow. And there's also a blog on my YouTube called the Previewing Summer Eclipses. And that has the information there too about the eclipses, and also about, how you can get a chart read for that too.
So are you saying that you can read a chart online?
Oh yeah, I meet up with people all over the world, all year round, day in and day out, on GoToMeeting, Zoom, Skype, or the telephone, and I sit down and I read their chart for them. Yep. I talk to them about what was there at birth, and also where are the planets today and how are they interacting with the birth chart, so that you can have a sense of what's going on where. And again, a lot of people come in with a lot of really real anxieties. So sometimes I give these talks and then people come in and they're like, okay, so I'm really ashamed because I'm really concerned about money right now, and I know you think that's shallow. And I'm like, no, I don't. It's real life we're living here, and astrology can help us move through it. Sometimes having the information helps you have the peace, and that's part of it. Just have to be prepared to have a realistic answer. I don't blow smoke up people's butt. I tell them what's really going on, to the best of my ability. So, it's like people want to come into an astrologer. Sometimes it's wish fulfillment. When am I going to get something good? And it's like, no, I'm here to tell you what's really going to happen as much as I can. The good and the bad. So, anyway, thank you guys very much.
All right.
Yeah. Yay. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.
All right.